Today's video is a deep dive into the wines of Abruzzo. If you're interested in learning about an ancient wine region, one that's undergoing a tremendous amount of transformation, turning itself into one of the more interesting and exciting wine destinations in Italy, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine. For this video, I've teamed up with Kevin Day from Open a Bottle. A few months ago, I was traveling in Italy with a group of journalists when I met Kevin. He is an ultra Italian wine geek with a very keen interest on Abruzzo. He and I teamed up on a live video. This is an edited version of that. He covers a lot of detail about the region. On the back part of the video, I provide some of the colored commentary. If you want to learn more about what Kevin is doing, I've got a link down to his website posted in the description below.
Tonight's agenda, here's where we're going to go. Let's dive into this. So I'm going to take the first part and really give you some context about Abruzzo, talking about its geography, its climate, and the history of isolation and why that matters so much to the modern wines that we have today. And I'm going to talk about this thing called phylloxera, which, if you've studied wine, you've heard about this, across Europe, this plague that happened in the 1800s to grapevines. It happened in Abruzzo. That's not unique, but it's how they recovered from that formed the modern Abruzzo landscape in many ways. And then we're going to talk about that grape Montepulciano, which benefited from that. After that, we're going to have an exchange. Bob and I are going to have a little discussion. I think the main thing that we want to cover tonight is what a bright future Abruzzo has. Man, in many ways, this is, when we were there, we kept saying this on the bus. We're like, this feels like a place that's really finding its form. It's really emerging. So we're going to cover three aspects of that in those discussions. The first would be this move from being a quantity wine producer to a quality wine producer. And then second to that, we're going to talk about polyculture, which is basically agriculture of many different crops, many different products, as well as biodiversity, and why that's advantageous to Abruzzo, because we saw some things there that were pretty interesting. After that, we're going to dive into the tasting. So we'll talk about grapes and wines. We're going to cover Trebbiano d'Abruzzo tonight. Neither Bob nor I have a Trebbiano open, but I put it in the study guide because I know you might have a hard time finding Pecorino. Maybe Trebbiano is more available. And those can be pretty high quality wines. So we'll touch upon them. Then we'll dive into Pecorino and we'll have a tasting and I'll answer some chat questions at that time. Okay, after that, we're going to go into Rosé, which is Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, and talk about, just whether this is a rosé or not. The wine that I poured tonight certainly didn't look like a rosé. You may be experiencing the same thing. Then we'll have a tasting of Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. Bob will share throughout these tastings his perspective on what he sees when he dissects a wine, understands its different components and what makes them unique to Abruzzo. And then we're going to finish with the red wine, Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, and have a tasting of that. After that, we're going to finish up with just a little bit about the next generation of winemakers in Abruzzo and a discussion on that and what we saw. And we're just going to finish with chat questions. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into the whole thing. I know I've been teasing it for long enough. So here's a map of Italy. And I think, Abruzzo being one of the 20 regions of Italy, it's located right here. So smack dab in the middle of the country. And right next to that is Lazio, which is where you find Rome. So here's a little bit of a zoom in. You can see the city of Rome right here. The red boundary around that area is Abruzzo. You have the Adriatic Sea on one side. And, this is the view from the hotel room in Abruzzo, in Pescara. The Adriatic Sea is very, very shallow, and it's kind of like bathwater. I mean, it can be very, very warm in the summer times as it heats up because it's such a shallow body. But naturally, that has a role on the terroir of the region. At a certain point, you kind of start to see that the role of the closer that a vineyard might be to the sea might influence the terroir a little bit more. That's certainly something that comes into play. Pescara is the major city of Abruzzo. It's on the coast. And you may have heard of L'Aquila. L'Aquila is the capital. It's up in the mountains. And L'Aquila in 2009 was decimated by an earthquake. This is a very seismic part of Italy. The Apennine Mountains, which run up and down the spine of Italy, are constantly moving. They're the product of plate tectonics between Africa and Europe that are thrusting this up. And they're not done doing what they're doing. And so occasionally you have these earthquakes mixed with the ancient architecture of the region, things that are not built up to maybe modern earthquake standard code. You have some, a 6.3 Richter scale earthquake can be pretty damaging, pretty devastating. So those mountains, the Apennine Mountains that run up and down Italy, I think when people think of skyscraping mountains in Italy, they're naturally thinking of the Alps, the Dolomites, the famous ski slopes of up north outside of Torino. The Apennines are no joke. These are huge mountains in their own right. And right in the middle of them is the highest of the Apennines, right here in Abruzzo, which is Gran Sasso. The only mountain in Italy outside of the Alps that is taller than Gran Sasso, believe it or not, is Mount Etna on Sicily. So another very important wine mountain, a place that I was just at last month. But Gran Sasso is visible from across Abruzzo. It's spectacular. Being from Colorado, it reminds me of some of the mountains that we have here. Only the most rocky of the ones that we have here in Colorado. It's certainly very, very dramatic. This is the wine region in Abruzzo. This would be where the vineyards are. They all kind of fit under the same denomination of controlled origin, or DOC. So Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, and Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, those are the big players. Those are the big appellation-controlled wines of the region. They're all from the same geographic zone with a few discrepancies. There's a few that are devoted to Montepulciano that have been elevated to DOCG. I wouldn't concern myself too much with those at this point. Montepulciano d'Abruzzo is the one that you're going to find on your shelf for the most part, as well as these two other wines. And it's inside that purple area. And as I mentioned earlier, with the Adriatic Sea on one side, the Apennine Mountains on the other, terroir is really a function of how much cool mountain breeze am I getting through my valley, through my vineyards, how much warm, balmy humidity am I getting off of the Adriatic through my vineyards, and you can kind of triangulate that proximity from the coast into the mountains. A lot of the soil here is very clay-rich, not particularly a huge part of the story tonight. We're not going to really cover soil. I think we really want to cover more the grape varieties, the business of Abruzzo, the history and culture of it. But nonetheless, the soil certainly supports the grape varieties very nicely. Now, Abruzzo's history is not one that we read about in textbooks very often because it was a place of very extreme isolation. It's lacked a major trade center for a long time. Not a surprise when you see how rocky it is. The major Roman roads of ancient times, such as the Appia Antica, they went around. They went to the south. They skirted this area because it was far too rugged, and also not having a port on the Adriatic. It was kind of pointless to have a road going through these mountains that was of major consequence. And so as a result, because it's a very rural area, it's always been very rural, but throughout certain periods in time, it's been a real hardscrabble life, especially after World War II, when you had a large drain of the population going into industrial centers. The agrarian lifestyle of Abruzzo was a very, very difficult place to make a good living on. And so that's helped to define what the landscape is today. It's important to note that wine has been a big business for Abruzzo, but going back to the Middle Ages, this is not fine wine in the sense that we think of wine today. This was wine that was done for practical reasons. It was a drink of choice for everybody because it was more safe than the drinking water at the time. So oftentimes wines were sold in bulk, sold in cask, and oftentimes they were sold further to the north, Tuscany, Veneto, northern regions of Europe. That really drove a lot of the wine business in Abruzzo, so much so that when you have phylloxera come through, which was this pest from North America that was accidentally imported into Europe, it's a louse that eats roots. When phylloxera comes and starts just gobbling up the entire European viticultural landscape and finally working its way into Abruzzo in the late 1800s, the grapevine diversity that naturally occurs in a remote place like Abruzzo, where you have valleys galore, rugged separation, that starts to diminish greatly because phylloxera is eating everything in sight. And Abruzzo's soils are not the kind of soils that would help to tamp down phylloxera. So you go to a volcanic place like Etna, phylloxera has a harder time in volcanic soils. So you might find some vines there that predate phylloxera on this plague. We call those pre-phylloxera vines, if you ever hear that when you're reading about wine. Abruzzo doesn't have that because its climate or its soil really did nothing to discourage phylloxera from doing what it did. So as the industry rebounds, as they decide to replant their vines on American rootstock, which is resistant to phylloxera, they start to replant with Montepulciano, this grape that we're drinking here tonight in two of the wines. It's a red grape. It's particularly suited well to Abruzzo. It can give you some big yields, can be fairly easy to work with. It doesn't mind the Adriatic Sea and the influence of that. And so Abruzzo, trying to satisfy its thirsty customers, goes big on Montepulciano. So I hate to throw a pie chart on you on a Sunday night, but nonetheless, this illustrates how different Abruzzo is from many of the Italian wine regions that we study. It's 50% planted to Montepulciano today. That's actually fairly high for Italy. Italy, if you look at some of these other regions that we know, Piemonte, its most popular grape is Barbera by Vineyard Plantings, and it's only 1/3, not even that. Galera, which is, you think Galera, that's the grape that goes into Prosecco. Think about how many bottles of Prosecco are made in Veneto. It's astounding, right? Even then, Veneto's top grape is only 23% of all the vineyards. Really, the only region that's similar to Abruzzo in terms of this singular focus on a red grape variety would be Tuscany with Sangiovese, and that's 2/3 planted. So to me, that's kind of an interesting thing as someone who's really focused on Italy. But as I was talking with Bob this week, it was kind of, well, is this a big story? Because Bob, I share some of your perspectives from a global standpoint. There are a lot of wine regions that are planted much heavier to one single grape than maybe 2/3 like Tuscany is or Montepulciano.
Yeah, so I think this example really drives home that Montepulciano is king in this part of the world. But I think the broader story for this is this region has heavily invested in co-ops. And in a couple of slides, you'll see that there's this polyculture. And essentially, you have a high number of very small landholders for vineyards. But here you have the vast majority of the production coming out of this region has historically been linked to co-ops. And even though today's conversation is really about the new face of Abruzzo, there's still a long legacy of having this connection to co-ops. And I did a little bit of research on this earlier today, and there's still about 40 large co-ops operating in this area, and they account for about 70% of the total production within Abruzzo.
So I mean, those 35 million cases that we're talking about at the top, 70% of the production. Is that what you said?
So
yeah.
So you could float a battleship. Now, this is the type of wine that, with the co-ops, these are the types of wines that oftentimes you'll find in a Tesco and a public supermarket. I mean, these are wines that are very much built to opening price point. The region as a whole is in the process of shedding that image. And this is something that's played out time and time again through much of Europe. And I think another piece that's worth calling out is you look at the consumption rates within Italy, and this is really true for most traditional wine drinking countries. If you go back to the 1950s, it was about 125 liters per capita. Okay, that was a time when very inexpensive wine, volume, had a place. In today's world, in Italy specifically, it's about 45 liters a head, which is actually very high for Europe. I think only Portugal is higher at the current time. But there's been this shift towards quality over quantity. And that's a lot of what this discussion today will discuss.
So, Bob, I mean, do you think that it's fair to look at Abruzzo as kind of in a position where maybe Piemonte was in the 1980s, or Sicily in the 2000s, where you have it's probably more analogous to Sicily, where you have a co-op dominated landscape, huge vineyards for the most part, never been considered a fine quality area, yet the desire is there to be seen as such. The raw materials are there to make quality wine, and they're just starting to kind of coalesce and emerge in some form or fashion in that direction. Do you think that's fair to say, or is it too soon to tell?
No, I think it's fair to say, but I also think you can expand it beyond the borders of Italy. I mean, this is a story that's played out in France and Spain and other places as well. So this is not an Italian-specific matter. It really is. Many of the wine-producing places in Europe have experienced the same trend. It's just that Abruzzo is a little late to the game. And, what we saw there was, I think, is just this massive shift in mindset. And, we're at the very early stages of seeing what this region can bring. And, I mean, everything as you described, I mean, everything looks like a very bright future.
Yeah. So one thing that's real interesting, and you talk about Montepulciano dominating the landscape in terms of vineyard plantings, is it's actually the opposite from a land management standpoint when you look at the agriculture of the area. It's a polyculture. There's actually quite a bit of diversity. So this photograph here that I'm sharing is one that I took from Emidio Pepe, which is one of the most famous and most esteemed wineries in all of Abruzzo and all of Italy and all of the world, really. And Emidio Pepe is very much focused on polyculture. But just look at that landscape. You can see rows upon rows of olive trees in the distance. You see gardens in the foreground. There's vineyards, yes, but it's hardly rolling hills upon rolling hills of vineyards. Sure, there are some large vineyards in Abruzzo, no doubt. But nonetheless, there is this thing about polyculture and biodiversity in Abruzzo that kind of ties into the future of the area, but also it's really kind of hard-coded into the landscape, where despite that dominance of Montepulciano, you have cereals and grains, you have chickpeas, olives, vegetables, all sorts of other things being grown side by side with vines. It's not uncommon with some of these high-quality producers who are doing smaller yields that they're also producing an olive oil. They might even be producing their own line of pasta. And as a result of that, you have just kind of a different mindset for one. It's culturally very different than a place that is so focused only on wine. But on top of that, growers are increasingly looking at ways to incorporate some of these other plants in a way that's beneficial to the soil and to the operation of their winery. I mentioned Emidio Pepe earlier. This is Chiara de Ulis Pepe. She's the winemaker there now, the granddaughter of Emidio Pepe. Really sharp, very intelligent, had wonderful conversations with her during our visit with her. And I got this quote from her about polyculture. She said, "We are farmers and we have a responsibility to cultivate in the healthiest way possible, both for us and the land. So when you have too much of one thing, you have monoculture. It is important that there are many crops as many crops as possible around a vineyard, because the energy that a vineyard takes over decades has to be reintegrated. We rotate crops to reinvigorate the soil, and the age of climate change, that builds so much resilience because of synergies of the different roots." So what she's talking about here is things like nitrogen in the soil, planting certain plants that can bring more nitrogen into the soil, and as a means of reinvigorate, a soil that may have been taxed from a lot of use. So crop rotations, things like this is not stuff that we normally hear when we talk with wineries and we talk about vine management. But in the case of a winery like Emidio Pepe, they have some vine rows where there's actually crops in between the grapevines, which is very, very interesting. I think, secondly, when you talk about biodiversity, a lot of this land is fairly open. You can see these photographs here. You see a lot of grain fields. You see, quite a bit. But what you're not seeing necessarily here that we did see quite a bit of in the trip was forests. And I think when you have a land mix that is diverse like that, forests can have a way of kind of keeping the ground temperature cool in the area that's adjacent to it, which is very interesting. So all those things can play a key role in keeping maybe the conditions in the vineyard a little bit more resilient, a little bit more adaptable when you have rising temperatures, heat spikes, droughts, all these things that we're dealing with, across the world with climate change. And really, polyculture is something being hard-coded in Abruzzo. If it's not in a region, it's hard to suddenly give up vineyards and plant chickpeas to it. It's not how the system works. So it's almost advantageous that they already have this in place for them so that they're not so reliant only on grapevines. I don't know, do you have any other thoughts on that, Bob, in terms of like what we saw or what you've experienced? I know you just recently were in Paso at a winery that was doing similar things.
Yeah, this is similar to another topic that's really growing in recent times, and it's regenerative agriculture. This ties to that in some ways, and this again has to do with having the biodiversity, and it goes a little bit beyond what you spoke of. It can even entail what's planted around a vineyard. You may plant plum trees, and that brings in wasps that take care of certain insects and that sort of thing. But essentially, what wineries are doing in many places around the world, and we definitely saw this with virtually every stop in Abruzzo, is some sort of eco-friendly approach and taking a focus on not only wine production, but on that land stewardship.
Yeah. It is interesting, and all these things are a way for them to use less and less chemicals, be less beholden to that aspect of the business. There's a philosophical reason that some people might avoid using pesticides and herbicides, but it's also an additional cost. So these are businesses. They've got to find a way to do these things. In some cases, the regenerative agriculture, it might be more upfront cost. All these things kind of tie into it.
Kevin, I think you're spot on with that, because oftentimes you'll hear these conversations of, well, this will lead to higher cost. In many cases now, as the track record on this has a stronger precedent, what it's showing is those costs are more upfront costs. And long term, there actually is a benefit, not only in terms of protecting the environment, but also in terms of not adding.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So let's try some wines. Should we talk about wine a little bit more? Let's get in depth. So these are the wines that I've got open tonight. I'm going to transition into some grape talk. So when we talk about the wines of Abruzzo, typically, and I think a good majority of them are red that are coming from the area, but they do have some really interesting white wines, beginning with Trebbiano d'Abruzzo. I do want to caveat Trebbiano d'Abruzzo by saying this is the Forrest Gump wine. This is the box of chocolates where you never know what you're going to get, because the regulations, when you read the fine print, it has to be 85% Trebbiano Abruzzese or Trebbiano Toscana. I'm sorry, Trebbiano Toscano. And the issue there is those are different grape varieties. They may be called Trebbiano. That's partly because they look very similar in the vineyard. They actually taste very different in the glass. They actually have different kind of complexions to them. The remainder of that is also open to Passerina, Bambino Bianco, some other grapes. So you get a real wide variety with this category. I think that's partly why Bob and I aren't doing a tasting on Trebbiano tonight, because it's very variable. But nonetheless, it's important to kind of note that, despite these grape varieties being similar, being called Trebbiano, they perform very, very differently. So what's widely considered as the higher quality grape is Trebbiano Abruzzese, and you only find it in Abruzzo. It's widely considered to be that grape that can give you the most longevity in the bottle. It can create a wine that is really refined, can be complex, can have kind of a subtle creaminess to it, which is very appealing. Emidio Pepe, Valentini, Tiberio. These are three wineries that are very well known for working with Trebbiano Abruzzese, but they've also had their grapevines studied genetically to confirm that they're Trebbiano Abruzzese. So that's the thing, is it you may have a winery that suspects it's Trebbiano Abruzzese, but you have to get down to the molecular level to understand the difference between these two to get confirmation on that. Meanwhile, Trebbiano Toscano is the same thing as Ugni Blanc. So if you're familiar with cognac and all the different wines from around Bordeaux and the south of France, where they're planting Ugni Blanc for bulk wine production, it's the same grape. It's high in acidity. It's useful in blends, but it's really neutral. It's a clean slate. You can do anything you want with it. You can, if you want a wine that tastes like oak, it'll be that blank canvas for you to put oak on it. So it's a kind of grape that, I think when we were tasting at that trade tasting, certainly there were some peaks and valleys with this wine. I don't think there were any that were terrible, but to me, it was, you had a great Trebbiano or you had an anonymous Trebbiano. It was kind of one of the other. At one point during the trip, I saw Bob. I think it was after the trade tasting. I said, Bob, how's it going? And he said to me, you know what? I got to tell you, this Pecorino is the real deal. Like you're like, I am everything I am tasting here. This is really, really interesting with Pecorino. So do you want to kind of walk us through what's the deal with this grape?
So for me, this was a bit of an aha moment. I've had Pecorino, and again, we're talking about the grape, not the cheese. Kevin, you can get into the details of the story behind that. Mm-hmm. But the wines, I thought were really the shocker standout of the trip for me. And there's some characteristics of Pecorino that are really quite unique in the wine world. Oftentimes, when you have wines that have high acidity, oftentimes the alcohol will be a bit on the low side, or it'll be inverted. If you have low acidity, oftentimes that alcohol level will be higher. In this case, you have high acidity and relatively high alcohol contents. Many times the alcohol content will be around 14. And I think this is just a brilliant thing in terms of having that acidity that forms the core or backbone of the wine, but it also has some presence. There's structure, there's weight. It's not an overly aromatic grape variety, certainly more so than Trebbiano, but it's not a highly aromatic grape variety. And typically it comes out of stainless steel, cool fermentation. It could come out of concrete as well, which is an old way of fermenting wine, which is now back in trend. But my feeling was with Pecorino, it's a grape variety that it's all like blue sky and sunshine. I mean, it should be a very bright future. Now, what's I don't want to say it's holding it back at this point, but it's something that I believe is capping the potential. The resurgence of Pecorino is fairly recent. And many of the vineyards may only be 10, 15 years old. The vines are not actually that old in many cases. And I think as these vines age, and the yields are naturally quite low in Pecorino, which is really one of the main reasons why it disappeared so many years ago. When the focus was all on huge volume, well, Pecorino did not fit that description. In today's world, this is very much spot on and trend correct. And my feeling is the next big thing in the wine world, I don't think it's going to be some region. I don't think it's going to be any specific grape variety. My feeling is the next big thing in the wine world will be indigenous grape varieties because they tie back to a place that there's an authenticity to these wines. And I think collectively, you look at Pecorino, you go further south in Italy, like something like Fiano, for instance, the story is told over and over again. And my feeling is this is what a lot of wine drinkers are going to look for. Wines that are unique, they're different, and they have a historical sense of place.
I think it's important to point out what it takes for a grape to get even to this point, because Pecorino was all but gone in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Nobody knew anything about it. It had been a grape that the shepherds would eat as a snack when they were tending their flock. And there were two producers that simultaneously and independently of each other went looking for it. One in Marche, one in Abruzzo. I can look up their names here in a second, but they were looking for indigenous grapes in the area. They both came upon Pecorino in remote valleys. They took vine trimmings. They planted them, they fostered them, they cared them, they nurtured them, they learned about them. Then they made wine from them. Then they fine-tuned their wines. This is a really like almost like a miracle kind of story. You see it play out all the time in Italy. Scupatino and Friuli is a good example of a grape that was like that. And so as a result of it, that indigenous, that local kind of grape that is already, genetically adapted to the environment and suited to it, it comes up with some great things. So let's taste these wines real quick. Let's dive into this so you can do some tasting notes for us, Bob, and lead us through what you're experiencing. So the wine that I have tonight is that one pictured, which is Civitas is the name of it. It's from Lunaria. It's from Terre di Chieti. That is an IGP designation. That is not a denomination of controlled origin, but it is an Abruzzo wine. Bob's got Tiberio, which is one of the top wineries in Abruzzo. It's widely respected. He's got their 2022 Pecorino going. So the way we're going to do these tastings is we're going to have a little thing here. I'm just going to load them all at once on color, on the actual structure of the wine, and where we kind of feel it playing out, as well as some notes that maybe you might experience. A little bit on notes. These are subjective. This is what you might encounter. These are impressions. It's by no means a hard and fast rule, but these are some of the things that Bob and I talked about earlier this week as possibly being indicative of Pecorino. Do you want to talk about what you're experiencing in your wine tonight, Bob?
Yeah, sure. Because with the Pecorino, I'm drinking much better than you. So just so you know that, okay?
No way. This is when it's fine. Maybe on the Cerasuolo you might be.
This is much better than just fine. I think this is a brilliant example of Pecorino. And when you see these descriptors with apricot peach, this citrus zest, jasmine is certainly a characteristic that comes up time and time again. And if you're looking for markers that call out Pecorino, certainly that higher elevated alcohol, typically pushing around 14%, along with high acidity, which is rather rare in the wine world to have those two side by side. But the other descriptor that's not mentioned here that I experienced with a good number of wines that I tasted there was a green fig characteristic. And this wine absolutely has that.
Hmm. Well, I noted the lemon lime zest really showing, like that kind of that green character that you have in the lime. And then, it's interesting, jasmine. That's not a note that I'm real familiar with because I don't drink a whole lot of jasmine tea or anything like that. But earlier when I was doing my notes on this wine, I did write down tea because there was something that reminded me, whether it was herbal tea or something like that. It was kind of like a vague recollection of it. And now that you're mentioning jasmine, I'm wondering if that's what I was picking up. Again, this is just kind of the parlor aspect of tasting, but nonetheless, that's what makes it memorable. That's what sticks with you, right? I mean, it's
so Kevin. I don't want to get too far off on a tangent here, but these descriptors, when you're saying apricot, peach, lemon zest, jasmine, so on, this is where conversation around wine quickly becomes very muddled, because I may detect something and call it jasmine. You may detect that very same thing and call it something completely different. It's lost in the language. And what I like to focus on, especially when I'm doing blind tasting or if I'm doing tastings in more of a trade environment, there are certain characteristics of a wine that are very much set in place and are really not disputable. Now, these descriptors with various fruit and herbs and things, oftentimes that's open to debate, but there are characteristics in terms of alcohol, acidity, residual sugar, if there was oak involved. I mean, those characteristics are much more tangible. And I find that in many cases, it can be communicated in a way where everyone is on the same page. But specific to the wine that I'm drinking, what I look at is the front, mid, and back palate. And if you have a wine that extends to the back palate where the finish is long, oftentimes what that's an indicator of is you had outstanding fruit quality as raw fruit, that is. And the wine production in this is very much a hands-off winemaking. This wine is coming out of stainless steel. There's no malolactic fermentation in this wine, so it's high in malic acid, which is what you'll find in green apple, for instance. So it does have a bit of that sort of characteristic to it. But when you hold the wine on your palate and then swallow it, it's got some length to it. I mean, it like there's presence there for several seconds after you swallow the wine. Now, the story that I heard on Pecorino, what we were at a trade tasting, was there were several producers who discussed the ageability of this wine. Now, truth be told, I've never had a Pecorino that's been more than maybe 3 or 4 years old. But looking at the structure of this wine, the way this is built with the acidity and the alcohol and just the presence on the palate, I think this would be a cool wine to keep for a few years. I'd be curious to see what happens to it at maybe 6 or 8 years down the road.
Yeah. Well, we've heard a lot of talk in trade tasting about how every wine's age worthy, right? That's one of their favorite talking points when they're selling you on their wine.
But the truth is, they say all these wines are age worthy. How many people actually age wine?
Exactly, yeah.
There was a study that came out not all that many years ago, and I don't know how this information was gathered, but it was something like more than 95% of the wine, when it was purchased at retail, it was consumed within 48 hours.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I bought this 2 days ago, so I guess I fall in that boat.
There you go. There you go. All right, well, I'm going to take a quick break and bounce out of the presentation so we can answer a couple chat questions, just so it's not us lecturing all night. So let me take a look through here. So in a little bit, we're going to be referencing the chat. There's a few links at the very, very top that you can check out for later in the night about the next topics that we're covering. So let's see here. I'm seeing we've got 4 questions here. We may as well cover them, all 4 of them. We got, you may have covered this, but I thought that I would mention a white wine from Abruzzo that I enjoyed, Cocociola. That's from Thomas Wall. I don't think we encountered that one, did we?
No, we didn't, and it is a minuscule slice of the pie.
That might be the other piece of the pie that we were discussing when we were looking at the pie chart that had other. And we're like, well, what comprises that? It would probably be a fraction of that other, right?
If the person who asked that question knows where to get one, let
Yeah.
me know. I'd love
Yeah.
to get my hands on that.
Well, this is the thing about a lot of Italy, especially places like Abruzzo. Because of how rugged it is and how many of these valleys are isolated and how many vineyards are just sitting there being ignored. Who knows what lays in there, right? I mean, that's the exciting part for a person who's into wine, is that you just kind of wonder, well, what next little thing is going to actually emerge from all of this?
So Kevin, one other point that goes back to that pie chart that you showed with the various grape varieties. There were a very small slice of that was the so-called international grape varieties. I think there was just a touch of what Chardonnay or Merlot or something. Again, here's an area that very much is embracing these indigenous grape varieties, which in places in Spain, some areas in France, certainly in Portugal. For me, this is where some of the coolest, most interesting things are happening right now.
We'll have to look for Cococciola. We're next going to talk about Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. So this is an interesting wine. I took a class there and took this photograph, and it says the original farmer wine of Abruzzo. And what we mean by that was when the farmers would bring in the grapes for harvest, they would do a quick maceration of, a select bunch of the grapes to make a quick wine, and that's what they would drink. And so Cerasuolo is a traditional wine in that sense. That's what Bob's drinking there. He's got Cantinas, was it Zaccagnini? Is that how you pronounce it?
Zaccagnini, yes.
Zaccagnini, yeah. I have Tiberio. So Bob's producer of Pecorino. I've got their Cerasuolo tonight. So Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. I think one thing that kind of emerged when we were there was this question of, are you a rosé or not? So I don't know if I've got to hold this up here for color, but this is my Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo tonight. Not really a rosé color. Bob's, on the other hand, he's got some white paper. Whole other matter. It's almost coppery colored, carnation colored, onion skin. And part of the reason why you have this variation with Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, it's made from Montepulciano, the grape. So again, we're talking about that workhorse grape, but Montepulciano is really high in this pigment called anthocyanin. That's what leads to that purple color that you get in the red wines around the rim. And it is, by the very nature of this pigment, it gets into the wine very quickly. So any kind of, to make a Blanc de Montepulciano would be really tricky, because anthocyanin wants to leach into the wine and stain it fairly quickly. So if you think of, as an analogy, a tea bag, when you put it in hot water or even in cold water, you start to see the color kind of coming out of the tea bag a little bit, especially if it's like a red zinger or a berry, herbal tea or something like that. It's a similar phenomenon where you have the clear juice of the grape. And obviously this is just how rosé production is done. But because of Montepulciano's nature, because this grape tends to give so much color so quickly, you could have, a fairly dark rosé like I have here in my glass tonight. And it's not because the producer was trying to do, 4 days of maceration. It happens that quickly. But nonetheless, because of that, and because the regulations are so open-ended and open to interpretation, producers are really at liberty to make a rosé however they want. If they want a little more structure, they can let it sit on the grape skins for a little longer, get a little more color. But the flip side of that is that the wine is a tricky one to sell. So this is Elena Nicodemi, and she told us they were really struggling in some cases to get people's attention to taste their wines. You read up on Cerasuolo from an Italian wine writer like Ian D'Agata, Venice. You look at, you read up on these wines, and they're, people who are inside the Italian wine industry know this is a great wine. It's one of the better rosés from Italy. Yep, because of that color, it's a difficult wine to sell. People are they expect rosé to be a certain color. This doesn't quite meet it sometimes. So I don't know. Do you have thoughts on this, Bob, in terms of do we put too much emphasis on color when we're buying rosé? I mean, is it really, does color matter that much?
Well, yeah,
It matters to sell it. I mean, if they're having a hard time selling it because of color, but nonetheless, as a wine, someone appreciating wine, does it matter?
So when we started this conversation, I mentioned that I've been in the wine trade for 40 plus years. So if you've been around for a good number of years and you can think back to the 80s or even the 70s, a lot of the rosé back in that day was rather dark. I mean, granted, a lot of it was cheap, crap wine,
Blush,
but
right?
no, even going back to
Before
like
then.
some of the Portuguese rosés and so forth, many of those had this type of color. Now, generally, the skin contact on this could be just a few hours. It could be maybe 12 hours. I would say a day might be pushing it to the extreme. But this type of look was actually quite common until Provence came on the scene and really redefined what rosé was for many, many people. So you have that very short maceration. The wines are very pale pink. And, you walk into most any store today, I mean, again, depending on where you're at in the world, but in some places, you can find an entire section of Provence rosé. I mean, this is what the trade is pushing and generally what people are buying.
Now,
I think
Bob, oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just say I think the fact that they're doing something different is noteworthy and rather admirable. Granted, I can see there being some barriers to it, but the truth is, these are not wines made with some sort of mass production. There's not a huge amount of this around. So much so that, in my case, I live in the Bay Area around San Francisco. I had a hard time finding one of these. So they're not all that common. And I think if to create a niche and it helps to create an identity to Abruzzo, I wouldn't change a thing. I think this is a wonderful thing and just leave it be.
Now, is your bottle in clear glass or is it in dark glass?
It's in clear glass.
Okay. Yeah, and mine is in dark.
And
So,
oddly, yours is in dark. Okay.
yeah. It begs the question, are they in some cases hurting themselves by even categorizing it as a rosé? Maybe the method in making it is rosé-like, but if the wine doesn't taste like a rosé, doesn't look like a rosé, it's not being marketed as a rosé where they put it in green glass, are they going for something else? I think that's one little split that's interesting. I mean, we had a night there, Bob, in Abruzzo, where they had all the wines lined up on this very, very long table for us to taste. This was a trade tasting where I think there's about 80 or 90 different members of the media from around the world at this Abruzzo Fest. So they had, hundreds of bottles lined up. And I was noticing that the Cerasuolos, some were in clear, some were in dark. It was really a sign to me that the producers have different priorities for this depending on the producer, it is what it is, but it's good for consumers to know that.
Well, I think to that point, Kevin, there are some producers that claim that this wine actually has some aging potential. And if that's the case, dark glass may not be a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I have here today with Zaganini, if I go on their website, it's all about drinking it now.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, when I open this wine, I don't know if you can see this, but it has a synthetic closure, a synthetic cork closure. This is not the closure that they used in Italy. In Italy, they used a screw cap.
Mm.
So it's interesting that they actually shipped this, in this case, to the US market with a cork, even though it's a synthetic cork.
Mm.
So, I imagine yours probably had natural cork.
It does have natural cork, yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So, I mean, they're targeting a completely different audience.
I texted you before this that I didn't like this wine. I really liked Cerasuolo when I was there. I was really enthused about it, wrote a lengthy piece about it. May as well promote that here. It's in the chat. First Taste Guide to Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo. And part of it was Torre di Biati's rosé, Cerasuolo was incredible. The Chiavolich rosé was incredible. And it was partly because they just had this amazing orange-like citrus acidity to them that just seemed to have a great endurance, great persistence. But it was also just nice to have something that's different, that adds something to the conversation, right? This is not a typical wine that they're going for. The one that I'm tasting tonight, it's come around a little bit, fortunately. It's kind of found its form, and it's improved quite a bit since I texted you beforehand. But my initial impression was it was funky. It was almost like it might be like a little bit of Brett inside there. Now it's kind of blown off a little bit, but nonetheless, you do encounter some Cerasuolos that are a little rustic. I mean, like they have a little bit of like an edge to them, which I think is kind of interesting. Certainly not something you would use to describe a Provence rosé.
Kevin, one other point worth calling out with the color, and this will vary depending on where you're at in the world, but I'm saying this from a U.S. perspective. Darker colored rosé is oftentimes the expectation is, oh, that will be sweet. It'll have sweetness to it. These have none. I mean, every example I had was fermented dry. So associating color in terms of residual sugar, put that notion to rest. It doesn't hold up.
That's a very good point. Very good point. All right. So we're gonna I was gonna do this earlier. Anyhow, out of order. We're gonna move to Montepulciano d'Abruzzo now. So the last wine. And in the case of this wine, anytime you do any kind of educational stuff on Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, you have to start the conversation by talking about Tuscany, namely the fact that there is this town in Tuscany called Montepulciano. And not only is there a town there that's a big tourist draw, there's there's a wine that Bob's got from Montepulciano. This is a big wine town in Tuscany. It's a very important wine town. And their wine is called Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. The second wine that they make is called Rosso di Montepulciano. This is in Tuscany. It's in the Val d'Orcia area. It's very popular amongst tourists. It's actually where the light went on for me on wine, that I really liked wine. It was actually this very wine that I have a photograph of down here, where I had a vertical tasting of multiple vintages in Montepulciano on a vacation. And I'd never had a wine from 3 different years and seen what vintage variation was about. And I was fascinated. That set me off on this road. So nonetheless, the thing you got to know is that's a Sangiovese wine, just like what you'd get out of Chianti Classico. It's a different biotype of Sangiovese than what you have in Brunello di Montalcino, but nonetheless, it is a Sangiovese wine. This is Tuscany we're talking about. Meanwhile, Montepulciano d'Abruzzo is the grape of Abruzzo. So it is the Montepulciano grape. Super confusing. It is what it is, but it's important to know that. And it's easy to look at a wine list that, in a restaurant, you have a conversation with your friends, and you might mistake one for the other just based on seeing Montepulciano. Now, I was doing a dry run of this beforehand, and then my wife said, do you know what Montepulciano means in Italian? Did you look that up? And I was like, well, it's mountain of something. I don't. She did a quick search, and I don't know if there's any truth to this, and I'm probably never going to be allowed in the town of Montepulciano after this, but she said it means mountain of fleas. But I don't know if that's true or not. Fleas. Yeah, like you'd have on a dog. Anyhow, I'm probably wrong in that. But nonetheless, I'll probably never be invited even to Abruzzo for having said that. I'll have to do a little bit more research to see if that's true. But pulci, P-U-L-C-I, is fleas, apparently, in Italian. I don't think that's the case. I think it's probably safe to say it's probably a family name that took this. But nonetheless, moving forward with Montepulciano, the grape, the wine, you will find it in a few of the appellations of Abruzzo. I really wouldn't trouble yourself with seeking out the DOCG wines for Montepulciano in Abruzzo. These are valleys that are distinct and different from the DOC. They've made an effort to be raised as DOCG wines, so they have more regulations that are affecting them. You're not going to notice too much difference in the glass. I certainly didn't with those wines. I think the potential might be there, but nonetheless, I would say focus on Montepulciano d'Abruzzo DOC. It's enough already to keep track of. Now, why this grape is called what it's called, and whether it has a relationship with Tuscany, is a subject of fierce debate. And so it's really, we don't say with confidence what we know yet in terms of why it is the way it is. There is some thought that this could be Prugnolo Gentile, which is a grape that is grown indigenously in Tuscany in Montepulciano, and it may have migrated from there to Abruzzo, and that's why we now have that grape called Montepulciano out of Abruzzo. Another thought, which is a little bit more controversial, is that Montepulciano was buying this grape from Abruzzo to bulk up its wines, to add color to its wines long, long ago, and there was some sort of symbiote, relationship there where the grape became Montepulciano because it had a good clientele there. And who knows whether that's true or not? This is Italy. We oftentimes don't get a straight answer on these things. Some of it's folk tales, but nonetheless, there is some confusion on that. And there's even confusion on whether this grape is Sangiovese in the vineyard. Sometimes the leaf pattern, the grape clusters, they can look fairly simple, but they're actually quite different in the glass, quite different in terms of how they taste, how they look. And the other thing is that Sangiovese, it doesn't grow in Abruzzo really all that well. You'd see it show up a lot better on that pie chart earlier, that infernal pie chart that we referenced, if it could handle maritime influences. But Sangiovese does not like being that close to bodies of water. It really likes to be high and dry. It likes elevation. It likes certain soil types, which just doesn't line up with Abruzzo. Okay, so for tasting, this is what I've got. Is Aries is the name of this wine. It's from Fosso Corno. It's a Montepulciano from the 2021 vintage. Bob's got Familia de Cerchio, and this is the Torre Maria Montepulciano d'Abruzzo. So as we look into these wines and the color, I'm going to load all these at once here. Do you want to lead us a little bit on what you're experiencing with these wines? I know Bob's got a deep dive video on Montepulciano, which we have linked in the chat. But is there anything that you want to comment on, Bob, in terms of what you're getting in the glass with these wines and how if you were to identify this as Montepulciano blind, what would give it away?
Well, first off, I'll say I've drank Montepulciano di Abruzzo for 30 plus years. I've been a fan of this for a long, long time. The styles can be all over the place, and you can see by the graph here, the alcohol levels. I've seen alcohol levels as low as 12, as high as 14.5. The tannin levels can be all over the place. Some will use oak, some do not. Some are using some whole berry, others are not. I mean, the styles are all over the place. So I think that makes it a little bit challenging. But there are some common characteristics that seem to carry through no matter what the production method is. That dark cherry note certainly is one of the markers. That sort of like tapenade, olive tapenade note is something that's rather common. And pomegranate is another. And we didn't talk about the actual tasting note with the Cerasuolo, but that wine also definitely has a pomegranate sort of note to it as well. The acidity on the wines are not high, but there's certainly enough where it holds the wine together. If it's a warmer growing season, getting late into the year, sometimes you'll have grape varieties where the acidity levels will collapse. Not so much the case with Montepulciano. But one of the things that I find very appealing with this wine is with the tannin levels. Even when the wine is youthful, the wine is very accessible. And you think of something like Nebbiolo, for instance. When that wine is young, it can be quite hard and angular, a little bit, not the happiest, most fun wine to drink. Montepulciano is much more accessible. Now, the comparison to Sangiovese, I think this is really like night and day. Sangiovese generally will have less color extraction. Oftentimes, as you get out to the rim of the glass, with many Sangioveses, it'll have a bit of an orangey color to it, which you will not get with Montepulciano. And also, also Sangiovese generally will have higher acidity as well. So most Montepulciano di Abruzzo is rounder, it's riper. It's got almost like a plush characteristic in many cases.
How would you differentiate it from Syrah?
Well, I mean, I think with something like Syrah, you're getting much more of that cracked pepper, that black character. I think Syrah in many cases is harder, especially when the wine is young. Okay. Look, I am a huge fan, so much so that's Syrah. Oh, excuse me, that's Syrah. But Syrah to me is something that's built for what. Again, the styles can vary, but potentially Syrah is built for the long haul. And when you're looking at classic areas like Côte Rôtie or Hermitage or Cornas, that's not anything like what you have here with Montepulciano di Abruzzo. I look at these wines as having weight and structure, decent tannins, good alcohol levels in many cases, but much more accessible at an earlier age. The one thing that I think is definitely worth calling out on this is if you're a fan of oak, you can find oak versions of Montepulciano di Abruzzo. My feeling is in many cases, these are not the best examples of this grape variety, especially when oak is used in, whether it's with this wine or really most anywhere in the world. An excess amount of oak tends to dry out the fruit. It shortens the finish. And especially if you're going to age the wine for a number of years, that fruit quality will start to change, and it'll start to turn from primary to tertiary notes. That oak component stays. That doesn't fade. So it dries out the wine, and the oak eventually starts to dominate.
Is your wine oak aged? Do you know?
No.
Yeah, mine's not either. Mine's all concrete, actually.
This may come out of oak, but it's older, large barrel, so it's not imparting any type of oak character. It's really helping to soften the wine.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Mine's actually stainless. My apologies. But I think it's really just this is like a pizza wine. Like, I mean, it's a pasta wine. It's just a versatile player for so many different scenarios in the kitchen. I think it's really, to me, you mentioned pomegranate. I would add that the fruit pops a little bit more with this wine than some of the other Italian grapes you were mentioning. The fruit does not pop in Nebbiolo or Sangiovese. You have to go digging for it, right? This is a lot more forward with it. It's a lot more energetic, has some really good life to it. And I think it's actually kind of a refreshing and quenching wine, the one that I'm drinking here tonight. But certainly agree with you that it does run a gamut. They're not all like that. And
in many cases, you're looking at wines that are not all that expensive. Okay, yeah. So I brought this one. We talked about this a couple days ago. This is a representation of that co-op Montepulciano, which is, it's not a horrible wine. It's under $10 a bottle, but it's actually solid made. But what happens with this grape variety, and really with a number of other grape varieties, when it's planted in warmer areas, you'll get that spike in ripeness, and the wine will attain solid sugar levels where the alcohol could be 12.5, 13, 13.5, but you don't have phenolic ripeness. And so you get the body from the alcohol, from the sugar being converted, but the underlying element is really quite green. Now, with what we tasted and what I have in my glass today, there's none of that green character. The wine, I mean, you can tell the fruit is very ripe, it's plush, it's got good length to it. This is an extremely well-made wine, and it's not all that expensive. So you think of all of the mediocre to crap bottles of wine that you could buy for $15, $18, I'm saying US dollars. For the money, this beats it by light years.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge fan of Montepulciano di Abruzzo. And my feeling is, with all the changes that are happening there, this is an area that will soon be very much elevated. And I see the prices are certainly going to go up. But in terms of value today, it's right near the top of my list.
There's also something to be said for it not being, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a wine that is, punching above its weight class. And I mean, for us, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I'm sure there's the aspiration for them to, to leave their mark. But these, to me, I'd be really happy with this wine if it was something that I'd ordered in a restaurant and, had with a variety of different dishes. It's great.
Yeah, I think it's just a gem. Also, yeah. Kevin, with the other, with Pecorino, for instance, if Pecorino was grown anywhere else around the world, I'm not aware of it. Okay, I don't know who else may be growing it outside of Italy or outside of Abruzzo and Marche.
Me neither. Yeah.
But with Montepulciano, when I lived in Australia a few years ago, there are a couple of producers who grow it there in McLaren Vale, and I believe in Barossa as well. So I haven't tasted the wines, but I think that could be a fun comparison.
That would be great. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see what, if it's taken on a different character in any way. So Bob does have a YouTube video on Montepulciano, a deep dive on it from his trip to Abruzzo. He's got some video from his time there as well. You can check that out in the chat. That's the last article. It's linked in there in the chat. So before we wrap up for tonight, Bob and I wanted to talk about the future being bright in Abruzzo and specifically the next generation taking over. Earlier, you met Chiara, who's at Emidio Pepe. She is one of just many winemakers of her generation who are starting to take the helm here in Abruzzo. This is a Francesco Cirelli, who we didn't talk much about tonight. Another emerging talent in Abruzzo. And some of the things that you see in a situation like this, it's a little bit like a neighborhood that is up and coming in a city where the artists come in, and then next thing you know, the rent's sky high, right? Abruzzo is a place where the land values are appealing to someone who wants to start a winery, but maybe doesn't have the capital to buy into Piemonte, to Tuscany. They maybe don't have the capital to buy into some of the, certainly not Burgundy, some of the other areas around Europe. Abruzzo offers them quite an interesting proposition in terms of having an interesting and favorable climate, having that biodiversity we talked about, having the ability to buy an ample amount. In the case of Francesco Cirelli, his winery, he has two different lines of wines. The top wines, you see him leaning on a clay amphora there. He certainly is a big embracer of doing biodynamic winemaking as well as using clay vessels. But he has a separate line that's all negotiant based, where he's buying fruit from farmers around there, and that helps him with his bottom line. So you see this energy that's showing up in different places. He's just one example, and I think that's kind of the thing that we're noticing there is this is a group of people who are savvy and learning quite a bit about how to take the next leap forward by seeing what's going on elsewhere in the world. We met other winemakers who frequently who've built their internships through Chile and through California, and very international. Then they bring what they learned back to Abruzzo, and that kind of leads that next generational charge a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Bob, in terms of like things that you encountered, or why you think that this might be Abruzzo's moment?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to it is, I've traveled a lot. I've been to a lot of different wine regions, and this is really a vague general statement, but there's such a positive vibe here, and you can feel this energy and this drive to improve quality and to get that messaging out to a broader audience. You see these stories oftentimes in Italy where you have this aging population, and who's going to carry on the next generation, and you have these stories where you have towns that are decrepit and falling apart, and old homes are being sold for €1. You see that thing playing out time and time again. I don't know if it was just a fluke in terms of who we met with on this trip, but it seemed like most of the stops, there were young people in critical roles. And my feeling is, in many cases, when you talk to these people, they have a very strong sense of place, and they understand exactly what it is that Abruzzo brings, but they've also experienced the broader world. Many of them have worked in other places, so they have this knowledge that they're bringing back. And I think this place is on the rise, and I think in 3, 5, 7 years down the road, Abruzzo will be looked at in a very different way than how it's viewed today.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And it'll be interesting to see if we see more Pecorino. It'll be interesting to see if the nature of Montepulciano d'Abruzzo changes. It'll be interesting to see if Cerasuolo is marketed differently. There's a lot of things that are coming down the pike. It's certainly interesting.
I hope this video inspired you to go out and pick up some wines from Abruzzo. If you've enjoyed this format, go check out Open a Bottle. The link is posted in the description below. Kevin does a video once per month during fall, winter, and spring months. The focus is on Italy and France, with Austria coming soon. And who knows, maybe he'll ask me back for another video as well. If you've not yet subscribed to my channel, do it now with a simple click. Hit the notification bell to be kept up to speed on all things happening here. I post videos on a regular basis, along with a daily wine quiz in the community tab. If you have any questions on Abruzzo, please post it down below. I do my very best to follow up on each and every one. And until next time, cheers.